Hey everybody, in this video we are going to look at the world in which Luther lived. This whole week we are dealing with the German Reformation, and before we dive into the life of Luther, let's talk about his context. So up here on the screen I highlight a few things. When you left History 1, you got a decent idea about what was happening in the world, the rise of humanism, the Renaissance, all right? Things were changing, okay? But the Reformation really sits at a point of profound change, especially in the West. So let's look at a couple of the things that's going on. All right. Number one, the world is suddenly looking much bigger to people in Europe. Okay, we are seeing cultural contact between groups of people that have never met before. All right, remember in 1492 you get Columbian contact where the old world and the new world meet. Okay, so we're seeing not only this contact between Europe and the Americas, but we're also seeing an increased contact between Europeans and people in Asia and Africa as well. And we'll dive into all of this more once we're done with our Reformation unit. Okay, there is an increased access to knowledge. Books are more available and more reliable. Okay, it's not just monks and nuns like carefully transcribing books and scriptoriums at monasteries anymore. Okay, we have the printing press. This is a super big deal. Okay, we have defined European nation states, okay, with a variety of self-interest. In the early medieval period, you had all sorts of different kingdoms, and maybe the one thing uniting people was an adherence to the Catholic faith. All right, now we're getting very strong nation states. Okay, the papacy has been dominated by corrupt popes for a while, and this corruption has kind of trickled down. Okay, so there's this general trend of corruption in the church, but then there's also been attempts at reform, some successful, some not, but there is a spirit of reform in the air. Luther is not operating in a vacuum. Okay, and then pretty big deal here. The Ottoman Turks are gaining territory in Europe. All right, if you remember, in 1453, Constantinople fell, and ever since then, the Turks are kind of creeping further and further and further into Europe. Okay, so all this sort of serves as general background. All right, so up here now I have a picture of Luther. A Reformation was needed, okay? I guess in a sense, isn't a Reformation always needed? But there have been many cycles of like renewal and decay in the church, okay? I think this is something that cannot be stated enough. Christianity is constantly changing. It faces challenges and then it adapts to meet those challenges, okay? This is just sort of what's happened over the past 2,000 years. And this is, I think, a really important message to hear as people are talking about how, Christianity is crumbling, especially in the West. History doesn't back that up, and really either do facts. It's a super Eurocentric view of the world that, because really in non-Western places, Christianity is thriving. Okay. But more importantly, today, just like 500 years ago, this is a time of opportunity. Okay. It can and must be a time of renewal. And I will stop preaching at you now. And let's look at things. Okay. So here I have a timeline. And I have more timelines on Moodle, but here's just a really simple one. 1440, you have the invention of the printing press. Okay, so sometimes you'll hear people saying, the printing press was super new when, during the Reformation. Like, kind of. It would be like saying today, computers are super new, all right? It's about the same amount of time. All right, 1453, Constantinople falls to the Turks and becomes Istanbul, all right? 1483, Martin Luther is born. 1492, Columbus arrives in Hispaniola. 1505, and this has a direct link to what we're going to be studying in a second, Pope Julius II announces a Jubilee indulgence sale to support two good works: to rebuild St. Peter's in Rome and support a military campaign against the Turks. 1517, I think we all know what happened that year. Luther puts up his 95 Thesis in Wittenberg, Germany. And then 1519, Charles V becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. I'm going to talk more about him over the next couple weeks. He was only 19 years old. All right, so up on the screen, I have a picture of the Holy Roman Empire. Let's give you a little background on the political situation. Going back to History 1 for a minute, remember back in the day, Europe was more or less sort of a mess of different tribes, territories loosely bound by a Christian faith. All right, over time, we start to see the birth of what would become modern nation states: England, Spain, France, etc. All right, the German and Italian lands are a little bit different, though. Neither are actually going to be unified until the late 19th century. The Italian states do a lot of fighting, but we're mainly focused on the German lands here. The political situation is pretty complicated, but it actually plays a pretty big role in how the Reformation unfolds. So we are going to spend just a minute on this. All right. Remember, Charlemagne from History 1, grandson of Charles Martel. He was king of the Franks before he was the first Holy Roman Emperor. He was brutal, slaughtered his enemies. He also forced a lot of people to be baptized. He was crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800 by Pope Leo II. There's some significant issues there, but that was last semester. All right, we're moving on. All right. Key things that we need to recognize from this. By the 16th century, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was not an emperor in a sense that one might assume. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't like, say, the British Empire or even the Roman Empire. The various lands were run by powerful families. You'll read about various ones, especially in your book on Luther, okay? And there are 7 dukes who elect the emperor. All right. So it's not a hereditary position. Okay. Eventually it does become that way with the Habsburg line, but during the Luther affair, the electors vote on the emperor. Therefore, the emperor's position was not absolute, and picking an emperor was a really, really big deal. Lots of political wheelings and dealings going on. All right, I told you a little bit about the political situation, so let's think a little bit about what was life like. In your Gonzalez book, he points out that Luther lived at the same time as some other pretty major figures that you may not actually associate with Luther, like Machiavelli, Michelangelo, Raphael, Erasmus, Thomas More, Copernicus. All right, they're all contemporaries. So yes, it was actually a time of a lot of scientific and artistic advancement as well, but it was also a time of intense hardship. All right. Mortality rate was terrible. It was about 30 years in Europe. About 60% of children died within the first 6 months of birth. The plague was still regularly ravaging Europe. About every 10, 12 years, you would have a big outbreak. After Columbian contact, there's an exchange of disease. It's especially devastating in the Americas, which I'm going to talk about when we get to our unit on Latin America. But syphilis was a disease that came into Europe and had really devastating effects there. Transportation was possible, but still pretty difficult. We're still like many, many years away from the inventions of trains and mass transportation. We're talking horses and carts, okay? And the peasantry was poor. Landowners were often harsh. We're still dealing with kind of like this medieval feudal situation. Capitalism is on the rise, but this is anything but like an equal society, okay? There's no social networks really to provide for people who could not support themselves. We'll talk about the Peasants' War later on this week. But people are pretty desperate, all right? Remember, you have to be pretty desperate to actually try to overthrow your harsh overlords, okay? So, yeah. All right. Religiously, I mentioned the 14th and 15th century was a bad time for the Catholic Church. All right. not great leadership, corruption, the Avignon papacy, if you remember from History 1, there, the Pope moves out of Rome and he goes to Avignon. There's a time where there's 2 popes, there's times where there's 3 popes. All right, there's a lot going on there. Okay, but I did mention that there were reform movements before Luther. In History 1, we talked about folks like Jan Hus or Wycliffe. But kind of during Luther's lifetime, there is a pretty famous church reformer named Erasmus of Rotterdam, and I have his picture up here now. There was a time where Luther and Erasmus thought they might work together. It didn't work out. I can tell you more about that later. But Erasmus really did start some major calls for reform prior to Luther. Okay, so he was born in Rotterdam, thus the name, probably in 1469. He was the illegitimate son of a Dutch priest. Okay, so he went into a monastery at the age of 16 near the town of Gouda. He wanted kind of tranquility and friendship at the monastery, but he was really discontent there. He thought that the regulations were stifling and the other monks were uncouth. Erasmus was a bit of a snob, all right? Let's just be really honest about that, okay? He stated that the trouble with the religious or the other monks there was they continually hide like tortoises in their shells and worry more morosely about the smallest details of their physical comfort. All right, remember, Luther also has some pretty heavy critiques for the monastic life. Okay, so Erasmus ends up leaving. He becomes the bishop's Latin secretary, who was brilliant with languages. He then moves to England, where he decides to study Greek to become a primitive theologian. Okay, so he was going to study the earliest forms of Christianity. All right, what's going on here? It's kind of what happens in the Renaissance. Go back to the sources. Okay. So in 1503, he publishes a text that translates to the dagger of the Christian sailor. Soldier, not sailor. All right, it was printed over 30 times, 30 different versions printed, and translated into all sorts of other languages. And in it, he emphasizes the piety of the heart. Okay, in 1516, 1 year before the 95 Thesis, he publishes his edition of the Greek New Testament, and it offered both the Greek and the Latin Vulgate in kind of parallel translations. Okay, so a lot of stuff is happening here. All right. He brought ideas that were pretty similar to Luther in some ways. He charged that there were too many monasteries. He supported married priests and nuns. He also emphasized Christian freedom. He argued that the common people were burdened by the rules that the church was enforcing on them. He denounced the tyranny of ceremonies. He didn't care much for the scholastics, but few humanists did. In conclusion, what he was all about was getting back to the original Bible sources, the church fathers. All those things were kind of the utmost importance. He was brilliant, well-known, well-respected. He is neither a Protestant reformer, but he's not a saint either. You could say he had quite a bit of influence in the Catholic Reformation. Okay, in some ways he was really sort of an elitist, but he brought up some really important criticisms of the church, and he always managed to live just a little above his means, and you will see some of his influence on Luther, which is why I'm spending some time on him, but in the end they feuded, especially over the issue of free will.